introduce our speaker. Let's introduce Jim Eckles. He doesn't need too much introduction to most of you, but just a brief. He worked at White Sands Missile Range for many years in the public affairs office, and since retirement, he's written some books and spoken for us. But that's not all he does. He does golf, I guess, too, in his retirement. So, but we are keeping him busy with that. And tonight he's going to talk about wildlife at the White Sands Missile Range. So, Jim, take it away.
Thanks, Garland. Well, your patience is asked tonight. Normally, I get asked to talk about V2 rockets at White Sands, the first atomic bomb explosion, where the gold bars of Doc Noss are buried, things like that. I've always thought about doing a wildlife talk, but just never got around to it. And this is my first opportunity. So we'll go through that and we'll hit upon a number of programs at White Sands that I got involved with. So you'll see a lot of my pictures in this presentation. For those of you not familiar with the missile range, I think you probably need to understand that it's 3,200 square miles. That's as big as Delaware and Rhode Island put together. And here's a map of it. And you can see Las Cruces, where I am, and most of us are, down here on the Rio Grande. And over here where it says Holloman, that's Alamogordo over on that side. And where it says Wismar, WSMR down here, that's the south end of the missile range. And it's about 100 miles from there up to Stallion Gate up here. For me to drive from my old office up to Stallion Gate on some zigzaggy roads, it's a 118-mile drive. So I usually had to allow a couple hours to get up there. And you can, now and it's about 40 miles wide. So 100 miles by 40 miles, you're going, okay, that's 4,000 square miles. In reality, it's 3,200 square miles because of these cutout corners and the fact that White Sands National Monument, now National Park, sits right in the middle of it. That belongs to the Department of Interior. And this green blob over here is the San Andres National Wildlife Refuge, which also belongs to the Department of Interior through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So 3,200 square miles. This area up here, the fix area, and on the west side, this western call-up area, those don't belong to the military, but the military has contracts with ranchers out here, and it allows the military to ask for these people to evacuate for up to 12 hours at a time, and that area becomes a safety footprint for some of the missions. On those days, for 12 hours, the missile range is the size of Connecticut. And last I checked, Connecticut has something over 3 million people or thereabouts. So, and we're talking about an area basically devoid of population during a 12-hour period. So we're going to talk about these mountains here, the San Andres that run up the western side of the missile range, and the Oscuras up here in the northeast part of the range. Down here in the flats, we'll cover some things happening down there. Old Lake Otero is out in here, a lake at the end of the last ice age that covered several hundred square miles and was something like 200 feet deep at one point. So I'm going to start with bighorn sheep. And there are a couple of subspecies of bighorn sheep, the desert bighorn sheep down here in the south on the left, and then the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. And they're a little different down here in the south where it's hot. The bighorn sheep tend to be a little smaller. A ram will go about 200 pounds, and their hair is a little thinner, a little lighter than the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, of course, who lives up north in the mountains and has to deal with extreme temperatures. But the rams up there will run a little larger, up to 300 pounds. And you can see the vegetation these guys are munching on. This is a picture I took just along the highway, east side of the bridge over the Taos, or the Rio Grande Gorge, just west of Taos. So they have much nicer salad fixings down there or up there than they do down here in the desert. So at one point, before European man spread across the United States, it's estimated there are 1 to 2 million bighorn sheep And they extended east into Nebraska, Texas, and other places. And of course, as European man came and shoved them back and destroyed their habitats, those numbers shrank. It's estimated there may be 70,000 bighorn sheep now in the western United States. So let's see. Now these bighorn sheep been around for a long time. This petroglyph in the Three Rivers Park is of a bighorn sheep, and you can see arrows sticking in it. So, and this is probably a Mogollon image, which means it was done, pecked into the rock probably 400, 600 years ago. There's no way to actually date something like this. In the background, you can see the San Andres Mountains, where the San Andres National Wildlife Refuge is, which was created in 1941 to preserve and protect bighorn sheep. It's an area about 57,000 acres, which is about 90 square miles. And in 1941, they did 1943, they did a survey, and they had about 60 bighorn sheep. Of course, those surveys were done with binoculars, spotting scopes, and of course, they have no idea if they got every animal or not. So the wildlife refuge sits inside the missile range, completely surrounded by military property, managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You can see that patch here. And it's created for desert bighorn sheep. And a question I find interesting, and I ran into when I first started working, is who owns these animals? It's certainly not the missile range, the U.S. Army. And one might say that it's on a fish and wildlife refuge, that they belong to the federal government, et cetera. Well, in fact, the state of New Mexico, the New Mexico Game and Fish Department, claims all wildlife in all locations within the state. And many states do this. It's not unusual. So there's a disagreement at times on who has priority over these animals here and there. And as an outsider looking in, you see this. But what I have seen over the years is that these groups, these agencies, get along very well, because if they have disagreements at the low levels, the people on the ground and stuff, of course, those disagreements get bumped up to higher management. And if you get high enough in management, you're getting into people that have different points of view. They're concerned about budgets. They're concerned about public perception, things like that. And it may not be much concern for the animals. So these guys work together. They want to avoid raising issues to the very highest levels in management. So we've got desert bighorn sheep down here in the San Andres Mountains, and I'm not going to bore you with the ups and downs and the numbers and whatnot. We do have some numbers to pass along as we go through from the 1940s. We know there are desert bighorn sheep obviously before this. There were European sightings from the mid 1800s up until the 1940s. And people hunted bighorn sheep up until the refuge was established. So there are population factors, natural factors that affect the populations of bighorn, and it's drought, lion predation, poaching from humans, disease, and deer and livestock taking over the grazing or foraging landscape and depriving the sheep of their browse. Let's see, in 1978, as numbers started to decline, in 1978, 5 ram bighorn sheep were brought in, and lo and behold, they had scabies mite. And scabies mite is a parasite that gets in the ears of the bighorn sheep and can completely clog their ear canals, and it gets into their hair and under their skin. And it can cause the hair to fall out, which makes them susceptible to cold weather and disease and whatnot, and it kills desert bighorn sheep. And so the state of New Mexico, in cooperation with the refuge, and the refuge at that point didn't really have much of a staff, so this was a state operation, went in and decided they needed to take bighorn sheep and treat them. This was one of those decisions made by agencies, and it shows you what happens when you get a bunch of people together and they're given the same folio or folder of facts, and they come to different conclusions with that same information. In this case, we've got the choice of going in and rescuing the sheep, treating them, or letting nature take its course with the scabies mite. The decision was made to try and rescue the bighorn sheep. So in 1979, in November, the state hired a New Zealand helicopter outfit that came in, and they tranquilized sheep in the mountains, brought them down, and they were treated in this dipping tank. I took this picture of these guys all suited up to dip this ewe and the others into this toxaline. And toxaline is a pretty nasty chemical, and that's why they're all suited up. In fact, it has been banned worldwide since its use back in those days. They use ivermectin now, which is a chemical that has actually been used on human beings in some cases, a version of it, I should say. So something like 49 animals were taken off the mountains on the Missile Range and treated. It didn't go so well. 14 of them died from shock handling, and the toxaphene probably didn't help. And then 7 or so were given to New Mexico State for study. The rest were taken to Red Rock, a facility the state has out by Lordsburg. And out in Red Rock, half those animals died of blue tongue, which is a livestock disease. So again, it wasn't going to very well. And in 1990, by then some of these animals were reintroduced to the refuge. Through the 80s, the population continued to decline, and manager Patty Hoban wrote that in 1990 there were 23 animals left, and she predicted extinction of the animals, and it would be extirpation because there are still bighorn sheep in the state, but that they would simply die out. There weren't enough animals to keep the herd or the group going, and at that point they had estimated it would take 100 animals to keep them going. So in the animals continued to decrease, and during the 90s, one of the Missile Range's helicopter crews flying over the mountains spotted one of these guys, a Barbary sheep, up in the San Andres Mountains. And when this was reported to the New Mexico Game and Fish Department, they had a gunner come out the next day, and we put him in a Huey helicopter, and they went out and found this Barbary sheep, and they killed him. And he ended up getting mounted, and he was on display in the Wismar Museum, hanging on a wall there for a long time. And the reason they did that was they were so concerned about the population in the mountains, and that they wanted to produce as many lambs as possible. This Barbary sheep, a ram, can't reproduce with a bighorn sheep, but he could tie up a female, a ewe, when she's an estrus, and deny the species of a new lamb that cycle. And so they wanted to get that Barbary sheep out of there. So by 1997, there was one ewe left in the San Andres Mountains, because after this trying to rescue the animals in that 79-80 time frame and it not going very well, the agency stepped back and said, okay, well, let's let nature take its course. And nature did. And so they had one ewe left. They treated her, they captured her, they treated her, they captured her, they treated her. And they were checking her for scabies. And eventually she was scabies free. And so in 1999, they introduced 6 sentinel rams into the mountains. And the idea was to let them roam, and they would attract other sheep if there were any present that they'd missed. And also they were captured to see if they were scabies free. Lo and behold, they were scabies free. And that triggered a decision to try to repopulate the San Andres Mountains with bighorn sheep. Now, on the right is Kevin Cobble. He was manager of the refuge at that point. And I think this is Ray Varney on the left. These are pictures I took back in 2002. And so I don't remember for sure that this is Ray, but I think. And he was the manager of the Kofa refuge out in Arizona, out by Yuma. These guys, working with Gary Montoya, who was the refuge manager for Arizona and New Mexico, came up with a plan to repopulate the mountains. They then in turn went to the state agencies, Arizona Game and Fish, New Mexico Game and Fish, and their proposal was to work a trade. Arizona has lots of desert bighorn sheep, but not very many Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. New Mexico has plenty of Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, but not very many desert bighorn sheep. So they worked out a deal to do an exchange. New Mexico sent Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep to Arizona, and Arizona and the refuge at Kofa sent desert bighorn sheep to New Mexico and the San Andres refuge. So the first roundup or capture was in 2002, and I got lucky enough to get invited along by Patrick Morrow, who was the Wismer White Sands Missile Range representative, to go along and take pictures and report on it. So this is early in the morning. This was in November of 2002. The helicopters getting ready to go once they were good to go with the light to fly. And these are muggers and gunners preparing. These are Arizona Game and Fish guys that'll be in the helicopters. And this guy in the leather coat, if I was him, I would be having leather pants too, because the strategy, and this was, a lot of this was learned from what happened in 79 and 80. In 1979, they drugged the bighorn sheep before they brought them down. And they took a long time treating them and getting them over to Lordsburg, et cetera, which is probably what contributed to killing them. So this time they weren't going to use any drugs. They simply shot a net out over the sheep, and a mugger would jump out of the helicopter. He would hobble the animal and put a blindfold on it. And then they would get it back and sling it back to this area where we're standing to be treated. And whoops, I lost my view here. There we go. And get them into the crates as quickly as possible. Everything was done to go as fast as possible, as little handling as possible. So here is a sheep being slung into the area. And I saw a couple where they actually put a ewe in the back seat because the sling wasn't working. And this one was coming out of the back seat, I believe. And what they're going to do is put it on a stretcher here, 2 people in the stretcher, and the stretcher has 4 holes in it for the legs of the sheep so that the sheep can't get any purchase on anything with its legs and is kind of helpless. And the guy's walking beside it. They then transported each sheep over to a station where there's a cloud of veterinarians and experts that converge on the sheep to do this choreographed dance to do all kinds of stuff, to check blood, to take fecal samples, blood samples, to take samples out of the throat and out of the ears. This is Mara Weisenberger, who's the wildlife refuge, San Andres Wildlife Refuge biologist. She's taking throat swabs on each sheep. And here they're giving a sheep oxygen, and here they're checking probably gums for temperature and stuff. They were taking temperature on each sheep, and somebody's standing by with cold water to pour on the sheep just in case they went into shock. And so they did this in 10, 15 minutes usually. And here's Patrick Morrow, the guy that invited him. He's a wildlife biologist at the missile range. Part of it was taking junk out of ears, parasites, ticks, etc. And each vial had the sheep's number on it, so that could be checked at a laboratory. And they put radio collars on each one. And they were put into these crates on trailers to transport. And they wouldn't let us near the crates. I was able to take one picture looking in. Here's a ewe looking back at me. They didn't want us bothering the sheep, again, to keep contact as little as possible. So at the end of that first day, when it got too dark to fly anymore, we all got in the vehicles and we headed back to White Sands. The idea was to let the animals go within 24 hours of capture onto the missile range. And let's see, I've got some pictures of the release. This is releases in 2002. Brigadier General Bill Engel was there from the missile range to open the first crate with Kevin Cobble, and a couple of ewes came bounding out. Let's see, we've got more ewes bounding away. This was the 2005 release. You can see their radio collars on. A lot of other people, volunteers and whatnot, out to take pictures as well. Here's a ram coming out in 2005, and we've got a ram running away. 19 animals were released at the edge of the refuge that first day. The next day, the state brought in sheep from the Red Rock facility out in the western part of the state and released those into the refuge. They did it again in 2005, and we've got a ewe here. And after these releases in 2011, they estimate there were 120 sheep back on the range in the refuge and outside the refuge too. Now they estimate there are 200 bighorn sheep back in the refuge. So this was a very successful operation, and we've got bighorn sheep back in the mountains. They've also done some things to enhance bighorn sheep viability up in the mountains. This is Kevin Cobble showing reporters these little balls that contain volatile fuels that were dropped on the mountains here to do a prescribed burn to get rid of the juniper bushes and trees that have grown up because of the suppression of fire in the last 60 years or so. The bushes gave cover for mountain lions who would sneak up on bighorn sheep. Bighorn sheep like to be able to see a long ways. They see the predators coming, and they simply escape up the mountainside to get away. So that was one of the steps. There were other steps like getting rid of oryx in the refuge or allowing hunting in the refuge as well. And of course, mountain lions figured into that as well. And the question was, during bighorn sheep time, what about mountain lions predation? And so in 1985, the state of New Mexico started a mountain lion study on the missile range that ran for 10 years. It was designed to run 5, but ended up going an additional 5. And so here's a good close-up of a lion. The males on the missile range tend to be about 120 to 180 pounds. A female might be 60 to 90 pounds. And like the bighorn sheep, the mountain lions were noticed by Native Americans as well. This is a pictograph, a painted on image in Embryo Canyon, and it's Mogollon. And again, it could be 400, 500, 600 years old. Don't know for sure. So the state hired Morris Hornacker's Wildlife Research Institute out of Idaho to do the work. And the two principal researchers are Linda Sweener and Kenny Logan here on the left. Linda's got her directional antenna that she's using to find a specific lion. This is Frank Smith, a retired game and fish lion hunter, finder, etc. And he helped them then during part of this. In fact, he taught them how to do snares, bear snares, to capture lions. So the normal way to hunt lions down, capture them, whatever, was to find lion sign and send the dogs chasing them until the lion became treed, and they'd tranquilize it and work on it. Well, there aren't a lot of trees in the San Andres Mountains, and to have dogs chase a lion in the heat of summer or whatever, a long distance, it's just was not a good recipe. So instead, they used this snare method. And they would, and luckily lions like to go through arroyos, ravines and stuff, the low ground and the soft sand. So Kenny and Linda and Frank would go out and they would walk the ravines and the arroyos, find tracks where they found lions. And if it was fresh, they might set up a snare. And they might rearrange the furniture a little bit by putting bushes and branches in the way so that the lion had to go through a narrow spot, and hopefully put one of those 4 paws down in the spring-loaded snare that they would lightly bury under some sand. And they would check these traps every day because they did not want a lion sitting out more than a few hours, especially in the summertime. And if they caught a lion, and this didn't happen very often, it took usually 200 trap days to catch a lion. And they would tranquilize it, which was an interesting proposition because they usually used a poke stick with a syringe on the end of it. They'd have to get close enough to the lion to stick it in the haunches and give it the sedative. They would cover its eyes and head with a blindfold and take vitals, and then put a radio collar on it and give it a counter drug to bring it back out and let it go. And so they did this in the first part of the study. They captured and released lions, as many as they could get a hold of. The second 5 years is they removed as many lions as they could to see what happens when there's a power vacuum at the top of the food chain, see how lions move around, how they establish new territories and that. And so they learned a lot of different things here, and it was kind of interesting. I spent a lot of time with them because there were a lot of reporters, TV crews that wanted to follow these guys around, and I had to escort them. So I got to ask questions as well. And so a lion in southern New Mexico in the San Andres Mountains, the males usually had a territory of like 120 square miles. Females, only about 40 square miles. And those territories, everybody's very protective of those territories. So if you're a young lion and you're growing up and you leave mom after a year, you've got to find your own territory, and you've got just a few choices. You can try to take somebody else's territory, or you can try to carve out a little piece of territory. You can simply move on and try to find something new. I think usually what's happening when we see lions close to communities and whatnot, these are young lions that are out looking for a new place to set up camp. And of course, there are lots of conflicts and lots of fights. So one thing that Kenny and Linda told me was that over 50% of lion deaths come from fighting with other lions. They had in their home a skull of a lion, and it had a neat little puncture hole in the top of it. And it was an incisor that, probably from a fight where one lion had bit into the head of the other, and that canine had gone into the brain of the victim and killed it pretty quickly. Deaths of lions are not a pretty thing. Let me see what I got here for pictures. Oh, let me talk about the young ones a little more before we get into deaths. As a escort, I got to escort National Geographic a couple of times. George Mobley was a photographer, an old-time photographer with him. And Kenny and Linda took him out a couple of times. And one time we went into a den where there were 3 kittens or cubs in there. These guys are about 3 weeks old. There are 2 females and the male. This is the male in front of us. They can't walk yet. So this little guy is hissing at us. He's not happy that we're there, but we got to take pictures. And then Kenny and Linda took vital measurements and ended up putting ear tags in the little guys and putting them back. And in their experience, they never had a mother reject the cubs, even though they had been handled. And Kenny and Linda were very careful about handling. You can see they have gloves on, and they have a big towel there to wrap up the lion and stuff. Gloves also protected them from the lion's razor sharp teeth and sharp claws. So Linda's getting prepared to put a ear tag in this little guy. Oops, back to bears already. Okay, so lions, and let me back up even a little more. There were 77 females and 49 males that they collared. and they tracked these guys. And each collar was equipped with a unique frequency. And then also they tracked, they had a death signal. If the lion remained still for 12 or 13 hours, something like that, this thing would emit a different signal, a more rapid signal. And Linda's job every week was to fly up and down the mountains and use her directional antenna and pinpoint every lion that had a collar. And they mapped that every week. And that's what told them, along with other sightings, the territories of these lions. Because you do that enough over weeks and months and years, and you get a good idea of what area or territory the lion's taking up. And so when they'd get a death notice, they would go in and find the body or the carcass and try to figure out what killed it. So we've got 50% or more dying from just battles with other lions. Also, if a lion doesn't tackle a deer just right, it can be trouble. They found one lion that was all broken up, and the ground around it was all broken up and all torn up. And they figured that with hoof prints, they figured a lion had jumped on the back and failed to get a hold of the back of the neck. And this deer went crazy, smashing the lion against trees and rocks and everything, and downright killed the lion, and the deer got away. They found one dead lion under a bush. Didn't seem to be anything wrong with it, except they noticed one leg was kind of swollen. When they cut into the leg, they noticed 2 little puncture wounds in there, and then the muscle tissue was kind of turning to jelly. And that was because of a rattlesnake bite. And one lion they found at the base of a power pole, and he'd been electrocuted. And they figured, again, this was one of those conflicts between lions, and the one had climbed the pole to escape and cross the power lines, and they shorted out and killed the lion. So it's not all it's cracked up to be at the top of the food chain. They estimate after all this, the 10 years, that there are probably 35 to 45 mountain lions in the San Andres Mountains. Now, nobody says anything about bears in the San Andres. This picture was taken by Mara Weisenberger at the south end of the San Andres Range, just on the north end of the wildlife refuge. We've had bears before. We've had them near the main post, and we've always talked about them being yearlings or something like that, coming from the Sacramento Mountains, crossing over to the San Andres Mountains, the Oregon Mountains. This guy was spotted 2 years in a row, however, and it prompted the missile range to put out some trail cameras up in the Oscura Mountains, which are the closest ones to the Sacramento Mountains. They put out bait buckets, and lo and behold, they photographed more than a dozen individual bear in the Oscura Mountains. So this is leading to, oh boy, we got bear up there probably on a permanent basis. We need to devise a management plan, something they didn't have to do before because there simply weren't any bears. And of course, a lot of people know about the oryx on the Missile Range, and you see them everywhere now. And there's been newspaper reports lately about just here on the east side of the Oregon Mountains, we're seeing oryx. You see them up in the Jornada Ranch area. People see them all the way up to Mountain Air, down in Fort Bliss. Basically, there are thousands of them now, free roaming this area and on White Sands Missile Range. They come from the Kalahari Desert in Africa. And let me show you, this is one in Africa. And this darkened area on the African continent shows you they come from 3 different countries down there in the southern area. They are a big antelope, and they'll go about 400, 500 pounds on the hoof. And I can't tell you if these are males or females. They have identical markings. If you're really experienced, you can kind of tell from the horns at the base, but the genitals of the male don't hang down, so you can't tell if it's male or female. The females do have longer horns, tend to have longer horns, more slender horns, But again, that could be just a juvenile male you're seeing. So it's very difficult to tell them. And they've got this beautiful black and white mask, I call it, markings on their face. You'll see online people talking about, oh, they've got this hide and stuff to hide them in the bush. Well, that's kind of a dumb thing to say, because that black and white face makes you stand out like anything in the wild. And in fact, they're a herding animal. So here you've got 7 animals. They're usually in groups. However, you will see single animals occasionally. It's kind of hard to hide when you're a dozen animals at one time if you're trying to get away from the lions or something. The lions are always there. You've got to maintain your group and hope that they catch the slow Charlie's guy on the edge, Charlie's uncle. So anyway, they were introduced in the end of the 60s. Let's see, where do we want to talk about here? This was done by the New Mexico Game Commission, which was headed by Frank Hibben, all during the 1960s. Hibben was an interesting and kind of controversial figure. He was an archaeologist, an anthropologist. He taught at UNM. He was also rich, and he was also a big game hunter, and he went all over the world shooting big game. And he thought that there were niches in the state of New Mexico to introduce exotic big game so that people in New Mexico could enjoy that. And he convinced the Game Commission and then various landowners that they could introduce Barbary sheep, ibex, and oryx in New Mexico. And they had to convince White Sands Missile Range to put these oryx on the range. And I've never seen any documentation on the missile range's side of this on how that happened. All I can say is that at that point in the 60s, a lot of the upper management, especially the military, were probably hunters, and we were already allowing big time deer hunts. So they just saw it as no big deal. And also, the state really didn't know much about oryx at the time. For instance, they announced that they would release the oryx. The oryx would naturally stay on the missile range. Whoops, that was wrong. They said the population would probably stabilize at 500 animals. Oops, that was wrong. They also, the first hunt they did, it was in 1973, they set it up like a typical North American hunt. They said, we'll allow you to take 6 bulls, 6 males. Well, that didn't go very well, because when you're spotting an oryx at 100 yards, how do you tell the males from the females? So that ended very quickly as far as the hunts, and the hunts are not sexual oriented. You can take trophy animals, one-horned animals. There are also depredation hunts. There are all kinds of hunts now for oryx. And let's see, I got another picture of an oryx I took along Range Road 7 on the missile range. And the state of New Mexico, this is the fall issue of New Mexico Wildlife, has a big article about oryx. And with the oryx being seen on the east side of or the west side of the Oregon Mountains now, I think there's kind of a move to treat oryx as an exotic sightseeing thing. And there was an article in the paper about going out looking for oryx and what to look for, and to be careful, of course, because they can be aggressive if they perceive you as being threatening. Those big horns up there could do a number on you if they decided to attack. Although they're very shy, and I've chased oryx a lot, and they've always taken off whenever we stop the vehicle, get out of the vehicle, etc. So the hunts now have, there are basically permits allowed for hunts on the missile range and off the missile range. In 2019, there were 825 permits sold for oryx hunts on the missile range and 1,000 off the missile range. For the missile range, 45 were reserved for returning vets from Iraq and Afghanistan. 585 were premier or trophy animals. 20 were for people with mobility issues. 40 were for young people. And then 135 were for broken horn. You had to shoot an animal that had one horn missing, both horns missing, something like that. And then unknown are population management hunts. When oryx get into a neighborhood or in the missile range, an area where there are people lots, uh, they they present a safety issue. And so the state has a list of people who are willing to go out on a moment's notice and shoot an oryx. They have to pay the same fees, but they aren't given much choice. The game warden will say, shoot that oryx. And these are people mostly who are interested in the meat for the animal. And these oryx will dress out to be over 200 pounds of meat. And for $165 or whatever it is about that for the permit, that's a lot of meat for your freezer. And it's a low fat meat. People talk about it as being very tasty. It doesn't have a gamey taste at all. So I've got some other pictures of oryx. These are what you call brownies. These are young oryx, and you can see they're already starting to develop horns. These guys aren't very old, but they've got to get those horns out for self-defense. These pictures are taken from the Game and Fishes magazine. Martin Perea was out. He was allowed on the missile range to take pictures. Here's a picture I took of baby oryx that are young oryx that are a little older, and you can see they've got their markings now as an adult, and their horns are starting to come out. Horns are usually about 36 inches long, a little more, a little less. Here's another brownie, and this picture was taken by Steve Alred, who was a photographer at the missile range years ago. This is a picture I took of oryx in Rhodes Canyon after a snowfall. I was the first guy up the canyon after it snowed about 1.5 inches, 2 inches or so. So again, it's a cluster of oryx, and they traveled a lot in groups. Out on the flats, it wasn't uncommon to see groups of 30 or 40 oryx, again, depending on the time of year and stuff. Patrick Morrow told me once he ran into a guy on one of the hunts who didn't have a rifle. So he stopped and talked to the guy, and the guy said, well, I'm not a hunter, but I'm interested in seeing oryx. So I put my name in for the lottery, and I was drawn. I paid my fee, and he spent 2 days then just driving around with his binoculars watching oryx because he thought they were pretty cool animals. So on the missile range, we have a number of springs. Out in the flats, you might think it's just dry, 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 and it is most of the time. But there are some springs that have water in them year-round and have for thousands of years. This is Mound Spring in the east side of the flats, and that's a tour group that I had. And in the water is a state employee who is checking traps for pupfish. These salty watered springs have pupfish in them. And these fish are left over from the end of the last ice age. As the waters dried up, for instance, Lake Otero in the Tularosa Basin, which was, like I said, hundreds of square miles and at 1,200 feet deep, most all the fish died. The water got salty and hot. But these pupfish survived in little niches, little springs that have been flowing water for centuries. And they're not all that uncommon. Death Valley has some, Arizona has some as well. But because they've been isolated from each other for thousands of years, they are evolving separately down different lines. And because they're found in such few places here in New Mexico, Mound Spring, Malpai Spring, and Salt Creek on the missile range, one problem in any of those springs or water areas can cut your population by a third or a quarter or whatever. So the state considers them state endangered species. And so the missile range and the state and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have come to an agreement to protect these water spots and to survey them periodically for the population, see how they're doing. So that's what this state employee is doing at Mound Spring. This particular spring was dug out by the missile range back in the 60s to provide water for road work. and it's off limits now because of the pupfish, but it's about 10 feet deep and the water is just crystal clear. It's wonderful stuff. Unfortunately, it's pretty salty and it might make you or I a little sick if we drank it. This is Malpai Spring right here. And this is the lava flow, the Malpai, the end of the lava flow that originates up by Carrizozo. And this spring pops up and then flows out here into a marshy area. At one point in the early part of the 20th century, a farmer settled in here and he put a canal in and took the water to some plats, and he thought he would irrigate his crop. And he did that, and the plants sprouted. And after a few weeks of watering with this salty water, the salt accumulated around his plants and stuff and killed them. And that ended the experiment in farming using this kind of water. So there are pupfish in Malpai Spring. And this photo on the left shows Malpai Spring. This is an amazing spring. Depending on rainfall and water upstream and stuff, this spring has been measured at anything from 200 gallons a minute to over 1,000 gallons a minute. I mean, there is clear, crystal clear water gushing out here. And this is the stream coming from it back in the day when we had horses that would come down here and graze around it and drink the water. The horses are gone. This is what it looks like now. Reeds and grasses have grown back in the spring area. The other source of water for the pupfish is Salt Creek. It's not a typical stream. It simply cuts into the surface of the Tularosa Basin and is fed by the water down under the ground, basically a spring, I guess you'd say, because the water table in the Tularosa Basin is very close to the surface. There are places in the National Monument, for instance, if you dug a hole 2 feet deep, the hole would fill up with water from groundwater. Again, this water is pretty salty. At Salt Creek, when it really gets dry, the creek is reduced to a few pools in a sluggish stream, and the pupfish are in these pools, and the water gets warmer and warmer and warmer. And this gives you an idea of how hardy pupfish are. They have found pupfish in pools where the water temperature is approaching 100 degrees Fahrenheit and the salinity is much higher than the ocean water. On the other hand, the next day it could rain buckets right over that, and in will come a huge influx of water from the rain, and suddenly the alkalinity will go down to almost neutral and the temperature will drop dozens of degrees, and the pupfish just keep on plugging. So they're an interesting, here's a photo. I had no way to get an actual photo of these guys. I stole this off the internet. That's what a pupfish looks like. He's about 2 inches long, and the males during mating season will get orange and blue stripes on them. Deer. I need to talk a little bit about deer. Mule deer at White Sands Missile Range. And I know I'm running a little late here. I'll try to speed this up. In the 1950s, the 40s and the 50s, when the missile range began, there were so many deer, it was unbelievable. I mean, we know that because the Army used to allow deer hunts on the range. So here's an article from 1957 after a 3-day deer hunt in the San Andres Mountains. And it points out that there were 1,400 deer hunters in the mountains, and they took away 350 deer. The next weekend was a hunt in the Oscura Mountains, and they took out several hundred deer there. So every year during the 50s, they were taking out hundreds and hundreds of deer out of the mountain ranges on the missile range. And now if you go out there, you'll be lucky to see a deer going around, driving the roads and stuff. So why were there so many deer? And a lot of people say that, well, it's because the military, they took away the mountain lions and other things. And Patrick Morrow, I think, has the best explanation, because these numbers are right in the middle of the 1950s when there was a big drought on, which usually causes problems for deer. Patrick said that when the missile range was established, everybody had to move their livestock off. And in the San Andres Mountains, there were tens of thousands of Angora goats ravaging the mountainsides. And being goats, they browsed everything, all the low-hanging vegetation and stuff. And they had pretty much picked it clear during the 1930s into the early 1940s. So they got removed, and then the landscape, the vegetation started coming back. And all this new green growth, this full of nutrients and stuff started popping up. And the deer loved it. And Patrick's theory is that for years, the deer were taking advantage of this. They were going gung-ho, repopulating the mountains, and that's why the numbers were so high. And then as we got through the end of the 50s into the 60s, numbers started to fall a little bit as vegetation grew and deer had more problems finding that really high nutrient value stuff. So here are a couple of deer. We still have mule deer on the Missile Range. There hasn't been a deer hunt out there in decades, however. And here's Mara Weisenberger again. Oops, I should point out there was a proposal at one point to use the Missile Range as a starting point to reintroduce Mexican gray wolves in New Mexico. But when they did the study in the 90s, the big question was by then, and the drought in the 90s had started, deer populations were crashing in the 90s. And there was a real question whether there would be enough deer to satisfy the needs of mountain lions and Mexican gray wolves and other predators. So the decision was made well, they haven't ever allowed Mexican gray wolves on the Missile Range. Here's Mara when they were doing a deer survey a number of years ago after a fawn was caught in one of the nets. And finally, I wanted to wrap up with horses. People ask about what happened to the horses. They're aware that we had herds of horses on the Missile Range for decades. And there's a lot of mythology that has arisen about them. You'll hear people talk about the horses being descendants of Pat Garrett's horses or Gene Rhodes's horses, and that's just utter nonsense. Pat Garrett lived 50 miles away from where the horses lived and ranged, and when he died, his family, he had a large family, and they certainly weren't going to let the horses go and roam away. And Gene Rhodes certainly would have, when he left at the beginning of the 20th century, would have sold his horses as well. These animals are left over from when the Missile Range was established, and some ranchers didn't get their animals off, or they're escapees from the ranches that surround the Missile Range. And they were left alone. They were left to herd together and make colts and whatnot. And the population would grow. And for a long time, they were considered by the Army and the state of New Mexico as trespass animals. They were subject to the livestock board's rules on trespass livestock. And so the Army had a deal with the livestock board. When the numbers got a certain level, the Army would help round up animals and they would be auctioned off by the New Mexico Livestock Board in surrounding communities. 1989 or so, the New Mexico took a lot of heat for that because they weren't monitoring who was buying the horses, and they were accused of selling horses to dog food companies that would use the horses for slaughter, take them to slaughter. And the horses, so the state backed out of doing any more roundups. And so the population started to grow in the 90s. Nobody paid much attention to it. The Army didn't want to deal with it because of the expense and bother, etc. Horses started to go to springs like this in dry times. This is Mound Spring again. And eventually, by 1994, the numbers got way out of hand. In fact, they estimate there may have been 1,500 horses at one point. And in the beginning of 1994, we hit a long months where it didn't rain. It was just dry, dry, dry. And that put the horses in position to, they had to rely on the springs for water. There was no other water there. Usually ditches have water in it, old ranch dams have water. There's water scattered out there. But in 1994, there wasn't. So they're locked in. And in July 5th and 6th, missile range personnel started discovering dead horses at one of the springs. And that led to a look around, a helicopter overflight. And lo and behold, there were lots of dead horses out there. And everybody wondered what was going on. They took some samples and stuff, sent the material to a laboratory, and the horses were dying of starvation. They were locked into the spring. They were getting water to drink, but they'd walk out as far as they could go for a day and browse or graze and then come back to the water. Well, they quickly overgrazed everything around the spring, and so they were starving. And so this created quite a problem for everybody, especially the missile range. In fact, over 100 animals eventually died that we counted. So everybody was going, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? The public found out about this within a couple of days, and it was amazing the reaction there. Our phone in my office was ringing off the hook because public affairs is the interface with the public. And there were lots of people willing to do all kinds of things to help bring food, water, deliver it themselves, etc. There were other people that were just mad at the Army and cursed whoever was answering the phone and cursed us to hell and things like that. They were angry at us for letting this happen. And this was one of those questions about, well, do we let nature take its course? Do we feed them? The Army was getting all kinds of advice because the Army doesn't know anything about horses. And as people went back and forth on what to do, luckily, within just a few days on July 15th, it started raining again. And suddenly, these ditches and things filled up with water, and the horses dispersed back all over the Tularosa Basin, and they weren't starving anymore. But people realized right away they had to do something. Didn't want to be faced with this problem again. And so the Army looked at the state. The state actually came in New Mexico and said, you know, we've got a prisoner program that we can use horses to and use the prisoners to tame the horses and put them up for adoption, that kind of a thing. That fell through. The state wanted the federal government to fund the program, and the federal government said, well, we can't have a contract with felons. So it was a big problem. Joe Skeen, Congressman Joe Skeen, came to the rescue. He passed through a rider on a bill and got $1.5 million to give to the missile range, give to the Army to fund adopting the animals out. And that's what happened. The Army contracted with the Tadpole livestock company, and they would move the horses. Karen Sussman from the International Association for Protection of Mustangs and Burros came in and advised on what the rules should be for adoptions and that kind of a thing. A number of people at the missile range who had backgrounds in ranching and running horses came in and helped as well. And in fact, let's see, well, they all came together. It was a big team effort. And we started doing adoptions in 1995. And for $125, you could adopt up to, per horse, you could adopt up to 4 horses. You had to agree to keep the horse for a year. This was to get people in line with keeping the animal. Once they'd had it for a year, they'd spent that much money and stuff, as opposed to selling it off. And they had to have a big trailer to move it. This eliminated people. There was one guy that showed up and said he'd like to get that colt and put it in the back seat of his car. He'd put the convertible top down so they could tell him to go fish. They had a lot of these rules to make sure these animals were safe and got to good homes. And these are some of the success stories we ran into. This is Chaz in the middle, is adopted by the Hancocks here in New Mexico. And they use this horse for all kinds of things, to pull a wagon for show and things. And David Starrett here and his horse, Pagine, his mare, he had her gentled in just a few weeks. and was riding her in nothing flat. So it worked out really, really well. And over the years, we conducted adoptions here in New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, further east, California, places like that. Eventually, there weren't enough. There were enough animals left that we couldn't adopt them out. They were kind of animals that we figured weren't adoptable. Excuse my phone's ringing there. She got it. Okay. So another group came in and said, we will take all the horses that are left. And so we rounded up about the last 200, and they were taken to a ranch, a big open area, refuge area, basically, and released there to be on their own. And that left just a few stallions at the end. And since there were no mares, the decision was just, let's just leave them. And so for years, we still saw an occasional horse. You'd see a stallion or two together uprange. And, but now I'm not sure there are any left now. So these are the guys on the missile ranges side that were really responsible. Patrick Morrow, the biologist that did the bighorn sheep stuff and also oryx. It was his job to put together all the planning and whatnot for the roundups for horses. This is Les Gilliland, who is a descendant of Dick Gilliland, one of the ranchers at the missile range. He knew horses. I saw Les cutting horses out in a corral, getting them into a chute so the veterinarians could take care of them. And all he had was a fishing pole with a plastic bag tied on the end of it. And he could move horses and single out, cut one out and move it into the chute, nothing flat. And he was good. So this is a TV crew interviewing these guys. Back in 2006, this guy, Don Hoagland, jumped into the picture and wrote this book, Nobody's Horses. And I got to bring this up. I know I'm running along, but I wanted to point this out. This guy was a veterinarian who was hired to advise on some of the disease stuff and what injections the horses should receive and stuff like that. In his book, he claims that he led the effort to rescue the horses, that he was the shining white knight on a horse out there doing everything. And this book reads like a fantasy book. I mean, there's some factual information in it, but there's so much made up stuff where he's at the center of the attention and whatnot that it really is pretty bad. And one of the things, for instance, is that he knew right away within days that what was killing the horses, but all through the book, he talks about, oh, the Army, they may have let nerve gas go or something else to kill the horses. So he builds drama, just like the TV shows in today's world. It's a bunch of baloney. Anyway, if you want to read it, I wouldn't advise buying it. I would get it from the library and look at it there. And of course, we have pronghorn in the northern end of the missile range. There are a few of them. They're still hunted, but they tend to come and go. It's a small population. Aplomato falcons have been found. One was found on the missile range quite a good while ago. They're from Mexico and Central America. They were extirpated from the southern United States decades ago. They're quite common in South and Central America. But when one was found in the missile range, it triggered a response to try to preserve and not bother him, preserve the habitat he was in. And so we had a time, as long as he was in the area, to make sure he wasn't injured in any test or anything like that. In fact, shoo him away for some of the tests. That was years ago. Hasn't been back. So we assume he didn't like the missile range and has gone back south. And elk. You don't associate elk with our mountains right out here, but this elk was photographed with a game camera in the refuge at one of their drinkers. So this guy came probably from the Sacramentos across the Oscuras and all the way down the San Andres Mountains to get his picture taken at this drinker. We've seen occasional elk in other parts of the San Andres. In fact, one of our guys took a nice picture of an elk eating yucca blossoms up further north from this. But they're just transient animals. There's no herd in the San Andres Mountains. And with that, I will shut up. Any questions?
Jim, this is Garland. We had a few questions come in on chat, so I'm going to
Okay.
read them for you. I know we're running a little bit long, but I want to get any questions in here. How large is a typical oryx herd and what is its range?
I don't know that there's a typical size to a herd. You see small groups. You'll see small groups of just females with all of the young ones. But uprange during the hunts, I've seen groups of 50, 75 oryx kind of together, and they move a lot. They don't necessarily migrate in the sense that they go back and forth from place to place over and over again. They just move, and that makes it hard for them to do the aerial surveys because you don't know if that oryx you're seeing today was the same one you saw 10 miles over a day or so ago.
We had another question. Do mountain lions take down oryx?
No, there's no evidence that a lion can take down an oryx. Oryx in Africa did face African lions, but there's no comparison between an African lion and a mountain lion. And the lion and the oryx habitat doesn't overlap too much, although we do see oryx in the mountains, and the mountain lions could certainly take a young oryx without any problem, but I've heard nothing about evidence of a lion doing that. I should mention that when they were doing lion study, they picked up lion scat wherever they could find it, and they sent it to a laboratory to have it analyzed to see what the lions were eating. And of course, there was occasional bighorn sheep. Mostly it's deer because that's their preferred prey, but they also were eating a lot of small animals, rabbits, and possum and porcupine, badgers, and they found porcupine quills in the scat. And that just amazed me because that gives a whole new definition to the idea of roughage in your diet.
Yeah. We got another question here. Where did the Barbary sheep come from that you pointed out?
I don't think they know. I mean, they were not released anywhere near the San Andres Mountains and stuff. So he was a traveler from another mountain range here in the southern part of the state, and I don't know that.
Okay. And we did have a last question about how about the birds? And I know you did cover a falcon, but maybe that's your second presentation on the
Well,
bird.
when you drive up range, one of the things the environmental people did was when they removed all the surface communication lines, we had a wildlife biologist, and she asked that they leave every 10th pole and its cross arms. And so that becomes a perch for the eagles and the hawks. And of course, other guys build nests. You'll see ravens take over a nest on there. And so when you drive up range, you'll see golden eagles and various hawks on these poles. And I should mention that I was in Alaska at Denali National Park, and in the visitor center, they had a display of golden eagles, and they took or captured 3 golden eagles out of a nests in Denali National Park, and they put the radio communications on them, transmitters, and then they tracked these birds when they flew south. And one of those, lo and behold, came to the Tularosa Basin and probably made his home in the missile range. And then in the summertime, he would fly back to Denali to nest and reproduce. So that was pretty cool.
Okay. That's all the questions I got in on chat. I don't know if anybody had anything else.
At one time, Jim, you were up to 116 people.
Hey, great, Jim. And I apologize for all the ums and ahs. That was a little disconcerted there, but it is what it is.
Excellent presentation. Very
Good talk. Good talk.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you
enjoyed it.
very much. Appreciate it, everybody, for hanging in there.
With that,
Thank you, Jim. That was great. Come back next month, everybody, and you can hear the former state historian, Dr. Rick Hendricks. And hope to see you then.
I'll email you tomorrow, Jim.
All right. Thanks, Jim. Okay.
Well, a lot of people have already left.
Yeah.
As soon as it's over, it's over.
Who's left on here?
It's live. I used to empty out.